Hello, everybody. This is Moonlighter, both in the literal sense that this shop is called Moonlighter and in the sense that that's what this game is called as well. Moonlighter is a game all about running a shop, an RPG-esque shop, and about actually stocking that shop up with dungeon delving loot. And of course that may sound familiar to you if you played a game released in 2010, yes it has been that long, that is being kind of broken out to actually compare to this game a lot, that went by the name of Racketeer. Racketeer was an absolutely fantastic game, however, this game is actually not a lot like that. It has its similarities, don't get me wrong, and I'll compare it to this game a couple of times just to sort of, get the comparison out there, but really, mechanically speaking, it's not very similar. Racketeer has quite a few differences. I'd say just to sort of put it out there, the main differences being Racketeer was mostly focused on the shop aspect of the game. I'd say it was like a pretty good, 70-30 split, we'll say. Nothing to do with bowling. And it was like 70% focused on the shop management aspect of actually, getting the prices right, running your shop, making sure it looked right, making sure it was set up right. Everything to do with actually running the shop itself. And the other 30% was, and also, of course, developing relationships and things to do with the shop. And the other 30% was the actual dungeon delving and combat mechanics and all that. They just weren't super developed. They were, as I would say, complex as necessary. They did what they needed to do, and nothing more. And if you were like me, every time you were actually doing the dungeon delving and combat and all that, you were pretty much thinking the entire time that you couldn't wait to get back to the actual shop itself. However, most of the actual complexity was, definitely not in the combat, and it was definitely in the actual shop, like, managing mechanics. This game, however, definitely goes for more of a 50-50 split, you could say. It's significantly more even in how the mechanics are split up, and it tends to be, or it tends to try, to be based more significantly around attempting to balance the mechanical depth and complexity of running the shop versus delving for loot to put in your shop. And this has its own kind of, advantages and disadvantages. Right now, I'm kind of looking at all the things that I can make for myself. There is a crafting system, a couple of them actually, and in your town, you can go to these various NPCs and actually put your different items that you would like to make on wish lists, so that when you come across the materials in dungeon delving, you can actually identify them as things that you might not actually want to sell right now, and instead put in the chests that you saw earlier as things you want to keep back, so that you can build up a supply of them and keep them, so that you can have some to keep for later, and hopefully craft yourself some upgrades. These also have the very nice property of being able to pull from those chests for their supplies. So all of those, how many I own and things like that down there in the bottom right, are actually from the chests and not from my inventory, which means I don't have to worry about actually taking things from my inventory to actually keep, thank goodness. So you can keep things in your chest for crafting purposes, and it will pull from them. As you can see, there are several different kinds of armor and weapons with different combos, sort of strong and weak attacks, and a couple of different sorts of properties. Pure power versus different kinds of status effects, and different kinds of armors focused on different sorts of, I suppose, different sorts of styles, whether they make you slow but very well protected, kind of in the middle, or very fast but not quite as protected. It's fairly predictable, but does its job. You can also make some potions. You can, one thing I do kind of appreciate is the ability to craft potions using the various gels that you can get from the jellies in the dungeon, and some gold, or just forego the jelly ingredients altogether, but pay out the butt for the potions if you don't happen to have those materials, which is kind of cool. You can also craft some specific potions that do a couple of other things, like some map revealing potions. Although these get very expensive. Oh, come back. And you can enchant items. I don't have a lot to enchant right now, but enchanting allows you to enhance the attributes of some things in different ways. For weapons, the way is pretty obvious. It makes the weapon hit harder. But for armor, it tends to actually give the armor some armor value. Because normally armor doesn't actually have that on its own. It just increases your health. Whereas enchanting it actually makes it more protective. Which seems a bit counterintuitive at first, but you'll get used to it. And in this case, I could actually make my sword more powerful, but I'm probably close to crafting an upgraded sword, so I don't really want to spend the money on doing that right now. Now, as you can see, I don't really have anything to sell in my shop, and I've heard that's what you're supposed to do with shops, so let's go get some crap to sell. There are 4 different dungeons you can go into, as well as a final door that I don't know exactly what's behind, so, you know, I can't really tell you, but the dungeons are actually themed. So we've got the Golem dungeon over here, we've got the Forest dungeon over here, and where I currently am, the 3rd one, which is the Desert dungeon. So if we just step in here, you'll get to see what the actual dungeon delving part of the game is like. Now, as I mentioned, every one of them is actually themed, and the theme is carried out from the actual appearance to the enemies to the boss at the very end. The desert one is of course themed from sand to fire to lava and other hot things, and although I haven't actually fought the boss at any time yet, I'm assuming it's going to look pretty cool. Because a lot of the enemies in here are shaped in an interesting way, lots of like, you know, geometric shapes, dodecahedrons and things like that. That's kind of cool. I just like shapes like that, I think they look neat. But the dungeons themselves have actually been really interesting so far. Lots of very cool enemy designs, very cool enemy designs. In fact, I'd say that those are the actual highlight of the combat itself. The combat is actually pretty simple. It's nothing really to write home about, in my opinion, but the enemy designs actually make it really cool. You have just a basic, you know, light and heavy attack with whatever weapon that you have, and whatever other weapon that you keep with you, because you can have 2 weapons. You have a dodge roll, which is very useful and very generous with its iframes, and you've got a potion, a health potion. But the enemies have some pretty unique and interesting attacks in terms of how to evade them and things like that, and some pretty neat designs. Now that right there is really interesting as well. That is actually a preview of the dungeon that we're about to go into whenever we beat this one, which I think is really neat. It's actually a 1-room sort of preview of the Tech dungeon, which is the 4th dungeon, and the Desert is the 3rd. So basically, you can avoid them if you're afraid of them, because they will have pretty powerful enemies sometimes, since, you know, they're an entire dungeon ahead of you, but you can go in them to find some materials that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get until you actually beat this entire dungeon and its boss. So they're like a portal to the next dungeon. And the Forest dungeon, the one before this one, had portals to the Desert dungeon, the one we're in now. So you can go in and find some enemies and materials that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to obtain in any other way. So they're usually pretty worthwhile rooms to plunder. They're very cool. So if we just go in, we'll see what the decoration and enemies of the next dungeon ahead actually look like. So this is the Tech dungeon, which is pretty cool. So obviously very lightning themed, actually kind of cozy, a little bit Binding of Isaac looking in my opinion. It's kind of neat. I really like the way that it looks now, but pretty hard hitting as well. And there we go. Now we're able to obtain some materials that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to get our hands on. And I'll also talk about, when we get back to the shop and go into the, you know, the shop section, why I personally think these rooms, the sort of call forward rooms, are a really interesting bit of good design in terms of the shop mechanic. But more on that later. So, continuing forward, the dungeon delving is fairly simple, I guess you could say. It's kind of Rogue-lite-esque, but fairly interesting, mostly due to the I suppose, the enemy designs. And the boss fights are something else. The bosses are actually really fun. They're quite aggressive, and they have a lot of patterns, and they're almost like MMO bosses, or like raid bosses or something. You really have to pay attention. They have a lot of patterns, a lot of attacks going off, a lot of memorization. They summon ads. They do a lot of things that you gotta keep your eye on. They're really pretty hectic and a lot of fun. They're definitely the highlight of the actual dungeon experience, and they are a really good culmination, in my opinion, of the knowledge that you have learned from that particular dungeon up to that point. Now, chests are an important part of the dungeon experience as well, because the items in chests tend to be cursed. But curses don't work exactly like you would think. Curses are mostly positional, because this game is very like inventory Tetris based. So you also have this mirror, by the way. You can't drop items in this game, which you would think is a bad thing due to how limited your inventory is. And by the way, there's no way to upgrade it that I'm aware of. But actually, the mirror is basically completely superior to dropping items, because it does the same thing, gets them out of your inventory space, but gives you money for doing so. It's basically like the Heraldric Cube from Diablo or something. Now, curses are actually not always bad, for one, but secondly, curses are generally requirements for where you need to put items in your inventory to begin with. So, you know, this one says it has to be put at the top or bottom, and that one says it has to be put somewhere at the very left or the right of your bag space. So, effectively, they're just limitations on where items need to be in your inventory. So as long as you keep those spaces free, you can keep those cursed items until the curses are removed when you go back to town. But of course, as you can imagine, as you delve deeper into a dungeon and you get more and more cursed items in your bag, those curses get harder and harder to actually find space for, because you have more and more curses that overlap and need space. And of course, items, even if it's the same item but has a different curse on it, they don't stack together. So it gets kind of hard to have all these items taking up your very limited 20 bag space. And you want to bring as much back as you can to make your trip worthwhile, because, as you may have saw at the bottom there, going back actually costs money in this game. Unless you make it all the way to the end, and you're very strong or very lucky, and actually make it all the way to the end of the dungeon and beat the boss, you have to pay money to portal back out, which is why delving in dungeons is sort of a merchant thing. You have a couple of ways to get back. And by the way, that thing at the bottom left there that made a horrible noise, that was one of those classic mechanics that warns you not to take too long on a specific floor. Excuse me. If you take too long, that big green-eyed slime comes for you and kills you instantaneously if it touches you, so be careful. And that was a sick dodge, by the way. If you want to get out of the dungeon, you have two options, well, three options, I guess four if death counts, but you can beat the boss, in which case you can portal out for free. You can use the merchant's little necklace dealy-mabob jigger, which costs a fair amount of money, more and more money the farther into the dungeon you go. I think it's at like 4,800 right now in the desert dungeon, at like the second floor of the desert dungeon, so 4,800 gold to portal out. Ouch. But hey, obviously your haul should be worth a lot more than that by this point. Or you can use the emblem, which is usually for boss runs, generally speaking. Otherwise, you're probably not going to make the amount back, because it's usually in like the 5 digits of gold right now, like, you know, 10,000 or so. But it's a two-way portal. You can portal out, empty your inventory, get healed and things like that, and then portal back in to where you were. It's basically a Scroll of Town portal, but it costs a crap load. It's extremely useful, though, because, you know, you don't have to start from the beginning every time you use it. You can come right back. Oh, it's at 18,000. My bad. It's even more expensive. This shows some of the more useful curses. Some of these curses do things like portaling out items in the direction that they're pointing back home, so they actually clear a space for you in your inventory like that. It puts an item in one of those chests back home and just whoop, puts it right back. That's a curse that actually makes an item obfuscated until you get back home, so you don't know what it even is that you're holding, but sure is 4 of them. And there are some items that actually have a curse that's extremely useful if you use it correctly, that will turn an item into more of itself. So let's say it's a highly valuable item. It tends to be on really high value items. It says it will turn more items maybe to its left into more of itself. Obviously, the way you want to use that is to put really low value items, like a whole stack of them, to its left so that it turns maybe 5 of those into instead 5 more of the really valuable thing. So you have just multiplied the value of the haul of items you've brought back to town by a huge amount by utilizing that curse sort of against itself. So you can do a lot with the item system in this game if you use the inventory Tetris to your advantage. A lot of time in this game is actually spent in the inventory trying to, you know, rejig the items into the most advantageous position possible, and it's actually a lot of fun to do that if you're into that sort of thing, which I am. But the combat isn't bad, and I think you're sort of seeing why here. Even though it's very simple, it's the enemies that make it fun. I suppose you could say it's a bit like Zelda in that regard. I've heard this game compared to some classic Zelda games, and I think this is probably why. Because a lot like Link, you have a pretty simple array of attacks. There's nothing particularly special about your attacks, but it's the enemies that you're interacting with that make it really enjoyable. Your sword and shield is, you know, nothing to write home about, but how you use it and against what is, so that's pretty cool. And the bosses are great. Now, the actual boss fights I can't really show you because I don't have any recorded, but they're really enjoyable because of how large and crazy their attacks are. They take up like the entire screen, and their attacks have a lot to memorize, and even if it takes you a couple tries to actually get them down, there's a lot to them, so they're a highlight of the combat. The actual store opening and store management that you're about to see is a lot of fun as well. I have the level 3 store currently. There are 4 levels of the actual store that you can go through via upgrades and purchase, and you can also upgrade different parts of the store individually, like your bed and your chest storage and a couple of other things, and you can even buy decorations for your store once you have different levels of upgrade for it, which do a couple of different things. They enhance the operations of your store in various capacities, like reducing the chance of thieves coming in, or enhancing the tips that you get for each sale, or even things like having your store open for a longer period of time for each cycle, which is useful so that you can actually make more sales, because as you get more and more shelves, you can stock more and more items and things like that, so that hopefully you can, you know, make more money each cycle and sell more items. Your store can only be open in the daytime. At night you have to close it, so for if you can actually make this cycle last longer, you can hopefully sell more items and make more money. Now this is an interesting part of the game because when you want to sell items you have to actually guess the prices, but it's not entirely guesswork. You have this book here that actually shows you the prices of the items to an extent. Now, customers will make faces when they actually come up to the items that you have for sale, and the different faces mean different things. And there's one that you want to get each time that's a sort of just plain happy face, basically, and that means that it's basically the right price. And this book will show you those faces and the prices that has caused them to make that face if it's happened before. But it also ranks the items from the least expensive to the most expensive in each dungeon, so that if you've actually successfully sold something for that price before, but you don't know the price of the next one up, you can actually look at what items you have sold for what price, and then you're like, well, I don't know what this is worth. You can actually maybe look a couple of spaces down at something that you have sold for a price successfully, and then you have a better idea of what this one might be worth. You can say, oh, okay, well, I've sold something for 3,000 successfully, and this is actually placed a couple of spaces above that, therefore I know that it's worth more than 3,000, so let's start there. Maybe let's price it for like 4,500 and see what people think. So that way you don't have to start from scratch. Each time you get a new item, you know in the ballpark of what it may or may not be worth. You're sort of your own appraiser in that regard. So the pricing system is not really like Racketeer's exactly. It's a bit less complex, I guess you could say. There is a popularity system for items, but I don't exactly understand it. It doesn't really seem to come into, focus most of the time. The only time that item popularity seems to matter is if you price an item a little bit above what it's actually worth, the popularity will go down, because I guess you're charging more than what people really want to pay. And I assume if you do that too often, the popularity of an item will go down to a point where eventually people will stop paying that much for it, because this is not worth it to them anymore. But I've never actually done that enough to make that happen, so I can't tell you if that's true. Now you also see what just happened there. There are those 4 showcases. If you upgrade your shop enough, showcases will appear in the top of the shop, and those are for rich customers only. You see a couple of times customers come in with little symbols above their head that show what they want. Sometimes it's like a person reading, which means they want books or reading materials, and sometimes people will actually be willing to pay a little bit more than the common price for those things. So, you know, if a warrior comes in with equipment above their head, that means you should put down a weapon or something, and they'll actually pay a bit more for it than what normally your average customer would pay. Sometimes a very well-dressed customer with a little top hat and mustache above their head will walk in, and that means they're very wealthy. And those particular customers will make a beeline for your showcases. And in those showcases, you can actually put any item you want at up to double what it's normally worth, and they will still buy it. So I guess what this game is telling you is rich people are dumb, and they will pay whatever you want them to pay for anything. I'm not sure if that's a very valuable life lesson or not, but that's what the game says. So yeah, that's actually what the showcases are for. They're a very, very good way to actually make money. Basically, just have some of your most valuable items and put them up there for about twice their retail price, and wait for a wealthy person to come in and buy it off you. I don't fully understand sometimes, because occasionally they'll make that upset face but still buy it, and occasionally they'll make the normal face and buy it, and it doesn't really seem to matter, because it's still priced at the normal, like, 100% markup. And that seems to be what they always buy it at. I don't fully get it. It, again, seems to be based on this popularity system that I don't fully understand, so there's obviously some depth here that I'm not fully versed in yet. But this is basically how the retail system of the game works, and it's actually pretty fun. It's very satisfying to make a lot of money on your hard-earned goods and run your shop. And of course, keep some stuff back for yourself to upgrade your equipment so you can delve farther and get even more valuable stuff and make even more money. And upgrade your shop and all that. It's a pretty cool system, actually. Is it as good as Racketeer? I mean, that's going to be up to you. You're not an adorable anime girl, so that might, you know, have some influence in what you think of the game. But it's a really fun game. And it does the whole shop/dungeon delving thing very well in its own way. It's a lot more, I suppose it has very basic mechanics. It's quite simple. But I think there is kind of beauty in its simplicity, because that's what the developers were actually aiming for. It doesn't feel simple in an unfinished way or an unsatisfying way, because it's clear that the devs were actually aiming for a kind of simplicity that it has actually pulled off. And I enjoy the sort of pricing and price guessing and, you know, delving for more valuable stuff. I think the gameplay loop is actually a satisfying one, and I really like the music and the art style. So that's Moonlighter. It has an enjoyable and satisfying gameplay loop, I suppose, that will probably keep people busy for a while. And I think the repetitiveness is kept at a minimum because of the interesting and different themes of each dungeon, and the fact that each one doesn't actually last that long, so you're not really doing the same thing over and over for a long period of time, because you move on from each one quite quickly. You know, each one is only 3 floors and then a boss. It's not like you're doing the same thing for an extended period of time. Although I suppose that also means that the game is fairly short, so you kind of have to have one or the other, either extreme repetitiveness or short dungeons. You sort of have to choose. And this one chose for short dungeons. Also, thieves are a problem, and you have to tackle them. So tackle those thieves. I think I like it, actually. I think I enjoy Moonlighter. Personally, I probably would choose the kind of personality and strangeness of Racketeer, because I really like what it offered. But again, it's not the same game as Racketeer. It offers different things, and that's a choice you're going to have to make. It is available right now on the Steam store for $20 if you want to give it a shot. I think that its overall style is pretty admirable, and what it does with its simplicity is a pretty enjoyable experience if you want to give it a shot. It is also being continually updated to solve some bugs and to add some other content and other options for people that have asked for things. So the devs are obviously listening to their feedback and have changed some things about the game to be more in line with what people are thinking would be a better idea, involving certain mechanics like the store assistant that you see down there walking around. They have, altered some things in regards to those mechanics. So, that's always a good sign, I think, when the devs are listening to feedback and quickly wrapping things up and changing things, as well as fixing bugs, which has been happening. So, I mean, the last update was just a week ago, so this is being worked on still. So there you go, that's Moonlighter. If you want to check it out, the link is in the description below, as always, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. $240,000. Gold dollars. Not bad.